horses have appeared in art since the oldest known images. However, throughout history, nobody seemed to truly understand the horse in motion. No matter the time or place, the human eye would never be able to see it. And that is because of a very simple reason. A horse galloping is just too fast. And so nobody in the history of humankind had ever seen the true motion of the horse. Until today. June 15, 1878. It's a bright summer morning in California. A crowd of racing enthusiasts and journalists huddles beside the track on the Palo Alto stock farm. Several bulky cameras are carefully placed in a row, facing a pristine white backdrop, ready to answer the million-dollar question. Does a horse at full gallop have all 4 feet off the ground simultaneously? In the 1880s, details of how fast objects move were still unknown. Photography was too primitive, and the speed of the film was so slow that you had to sit still for several seconds to get your portrait taken, otherwise it would turn out blurry. This is why so many claimed it was an impossible task, but photographer Eadweard Muybridge was a stubborn man. Leland Stanford had hired Muybridge 5 years before to answer this same question. Stanford was one of the richest and most powerful men of his time. He had served his term as governor in California and launched a railroad empire. However, the stress of completing the Transcontinental Railroad had severely impacted his health. Stanford's physician advised him to do outdoor activities and encourage his involvement with horses. He became passionately fond of the animals and would drop business at any time to talk about them. The country was caught up in a technological frenzy. The telephone, the phonograph, or the light bulb were some of the inventions introduced around this time. Stanford himself took part in this age of development and financed, among other investigations, Muybridge's motion studies. For years, Muybridge researched the technology to make the horse image possible, coming up with faster lenses, film emulsions, new shutters, and improved cameras. And finally, today is the day of the demonstration, and everything is set up. The show begins as one of Stanford's prize horses runs across the track. Wide strip, one by one, the shutters of the cameras as the horse runs. The whole thing takes less than half a second. Muybridge goes and develops the plates right away, and in a few minutes, the image of the horse is unveiled in a way that has never been seen before. It's worked. Muybridge lays out the results for the crowd to admire. The reporters hurry away to share the remarkable findings. A reporter writes, "It was a brilliant success. The horse was exactly pictured." Muybridge has captured time, up to 1/2000th of a second to be precise. For the first time, we can see the gaits of a horse. Details the eye couldn't pick up at such speeds are now revealed. He has penetrated an invisible, radically different world. The camera is now more powerful than the human eye. Stanford had the answer he wanted, and the audience witnessed the foundation of a new art that would transform the world. The horse photograph was a historic achievement, but it wasn't enough for Muybridge. To understand the essence of motion itself, he would have to go beyond. This is the story of a brilliant inventor, an eccentric traveler, a pioneer in motion art before gifts, and a murderer, Eadweard Muybridge. Before arriving in the United States in the early 1850s, a young man called Edward James Muybridge changed his first name to Edward, borrowing the odd spelling from a monument to Anglo-Saxon kings on the coronation stone in Kingstown, his hometown. During his first decade in America, he worked as a bookseller in New York and San Francisco. He then changed his last name from Muybridge to Muybridge. In 1860, Muybridge planned to travel Europe, but on his way, the stagecoach he traveled in crashed in a mountainside while crossing northeast Texas, colliding with a tree, shattering the vehicle, and flinging Muybridge and 7 others onto the rocky hillside. His first memory after the accident was waking up in an Arkansas hospital, 150 miles away from the accident site. We got on board the stage, which was drawn by 6 wild Mustang horses. That is the last I recollect of that 9 days. After that, I found myself lying in bed. There was a small wound on the top of my head. When I recovered, each eye formed an individual impression, so that looking at you, for instance, I could see another man sitting by your side. I had no taste, nor smell, and was very deaf. Indeed, it was through double vision that Muybridge started earning his new living. Most of his landscapes were taken in stereographic cards, a technology popularized at the end of the 1850s. A stereoscope is a device for viewing a pair of separate images depicting left eye and right eye views of the same scene as a single three-dimensional image. He also made money selling prints of the majestic waterfalls and vast granite mountains of Yosemite, images that would later inspire Ansel Adams. In one shot, he posed as a lumberjack, legs wide apart, gazing up with fierce eyes at the immense trunk of a redwood tree. Carlton Watkins, a less-known contemporary of Muybridge, also took outstanding photographs of Yosemite. But while his composition is ordered, clear and focused, using the flat midday light, Muybridge is attracted to the chaos. Debris, dead branches, piles of rocks, unusual camera angles, and dramatic shadows. He also documented several groups of Native Americans, Chinese miners, San Francisco crowds, and soldiers, among others. However, he always kept a distance from the people he photographed, with very few exceptions, like this shot of his friend, the self-proclaimed Emperor Norton, in front of the Mechanics' Institute, one of the most iconic visual documents of early bicycling. Because of his documentary photography, he would be commissioned by the US Army to photograph the Modoc War. These photographs were presented to the public as reliable images and truthful news. But the man in A Modoc Brave on the War Path is not in fact a Modoc warrior at all, but a Warm Springs scout working for the US Army. Since Muybridge couldn't go to the front, he had to come up with something, so he staged the photographs. The stagecoach accident had turned a quiet bookseller into a strange photographer, and Muybridge would never be the same man. An old friend of his described him as a pleasant and quick businessman, active, energetic, strict in all his dealings, open and candid, who, after the accident, had changed entirely. He was eccentric, peculiar, and had the queerest of odd notions, so much so that he seemed like a different man. This change in appearance was such that I could scarcely recognize him after his return. In 1860, Muybridge married a woman half his age, the 20-year-old Flora Shallcross Stone, and 1 year later, Stanford telegraphed Muybridge about his idea to photograph his horses. For 3 years, Muybridge worked on that project, but this was abruptly interrupted by a tragic event. Ironically, it was a photograph that marked the point of no return. Things were going well for Muybridge. He was always traveling around and studying new techniques, but he never took Flora with him in his travels. He would disappear for months, taking photographs of nature, leaving his young wife at home. While Muybridge was away, a drama critic named Harry Larkins started taking Flora to the theater. Flora had a son in the spring of '74. Muybridge named him Floredo Helios Muybridge. Helios, the sun god in Greek mythology, was the inspiration behind his studio logo and one of the names he had used in the past. 7 months later, Muybridge found a letter in his midwife's home. In it was a photograph of his son, and on the back, his wife had written the boy's name as Little Harry. He stamped on the floor and exhibited the wildest excitement. He was haggard and pale, and his eyes glassy. He trembled from head to foot and gasped for breath. Muybridge got on a boat, caught a train, hurried through the night, and tracked down Harry Larkins at the Yellow Jacket mine. He knocked on his door, and as Larkins stepped forward, Muybridge told him, "I have a message from my wife. Take it." The only thing I'm sorry for is that he died so quickly. I would have wished that he could have lived long enough at least to acknowledge the wrong he had done to me, that his punishment was deserved, and that my act was a justifiable defense of my marital rights. The state of California charged Eadweard Muybridge with murder. He had shot Larkins through the heart, killing him instantly. Muybridge offered no resistance and was immediately arrested and jailed. At trial, he pleaded temporary insanity. The defense argued that the stagecoach accident he had suffered years ago had left him with brain damage. Indeed, the fact that Muybridge took years to recover from the concussion suggests that the trauma was severe enough to cause permanent neurological damage. This would explain the photographer's risky deeds and emotional explosions as telltale signs of damage to the frontal cortex, the brain region responsible for emotional control. From the witness stand, Muybridge recalled the accident, but the jury didn't buy it. Muybridge was always proud of what he did, and his insanity plea led nowhere. His lawyer, Mr. Pendergast, had to come up with something else. He argued that every fiber of a man's frame impels him to instant vengeance, and he will have it if hell yawned before him the instant afterward. The closing statement of the defense was described by the San Francisco Chronicle as one of the most eloquent forensic efforts ever had in the state. "You, gentlemen of the jury, you who have wives whom you love, daughters whom you cherish, and mothers whom you reverence, will not say insanity. I cannot ask you to send this man to a happy home. He has none. The destroyer has been there and has written all over it, from foundation stone to roof tile, desolation. Desolation. Send him forth free. Let him take up the thread of his broken life and resume that profession on which his genius had shed so much luster, the profession which is now his only love. Let him go forth into the green fields, by the bright waters, through the beautiful valleys, and up and down the swelling coast, and in the active work of the magic of his art, he may gain surcease of sorrow and pass on to his allotted end in comparative peace." The jury had their verdict. They found him not guilty. After the speech, the large crowd broke into a storm of applause, and Muybridge started sobbing on the floor. A convulsive gasp escaped the prisoner's lips, and he became as helpless as a newborn babe. Mr. Pendergast caught him in his arms and thus prevented his falling to the floor. He moaned and wept convulsively, and was carried out of the room by Pendergast. Flora immediately filed for divorce, and Muybridge boarded a steamer to Central America, leaving his troubles behind and going into exile. She got an illness, and 5 months later died in a hospital. She was only 24. The child Muybridge abandoned at an orphanage. Throughout his life, Floredo Helios always claimed that Muybridge was his real father. Muybridge traveled in Central America for about 9 months. He visited Panama and then went north along the Pacific coast, stopping in Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. He photographed the main towns, people, and coffee plantations in the highlands. And in the dark room, Muybridge manipulated once again the negatives, adding dramatic skies and creating moonlight effects for his photographs of the Bay of Panama and the port of Champerico. Muybridge made several albums for presentation to the appropriate people. Copies of these books were given to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and Mrs. Stanford. He advertised in Guatemala his Vistas Fotográficas de esta República and signed himself Eduardo Santiago Muybridge. Due to the lack of photographic documentation of Guatemala, these photographs hold significant value and serve as important historical records of the country in the 19th century. When Muybridge returned from Central America, he was eager to retake what he had attempted with the limited success before the killing, images of the horse in motion. The experiment was a total success and Muybridge became world famous, but not everyone was happy with the resulting image. Some even took to the offensive. When the first humans put paint on stone, they drew all the beasts they knew, deer, buffalo, horse, and they painted them in motion. The horses seemed to have rigid torsos, with their front legs stiff and lifted off the ground. But however primitive these artists were, no other artist could seem to know how to draw the animal in motion in the thousands of years to come. Neither the ancient Greeks and Romans, the Asian masters, nor the contemporary French artist Jean-Louis-Ernest Meissonier, known for his horse paintings, understood the horse in motion. Meissonier was a famed painter who paid careful attention to detail in his works. When Leland Stanford showed him the horse in motion images, Meissonier expressed his disbelief. "How? All these years my eyes have deceived me?" Stanford replied, "The machine cannot lie." Meissonier came to accept that not only he, but every other artist up to that point had not properly represented the horse's gallop. Meissonier had made hundreds of preparatory drawings and sculptural models for his largest and most ambitious painting, 1807, Friedland, which represents one of Napoleon Bonaparte's greatest victories. But no model could predict what the horse in motion images showed. The legs of the horse are actually curled up under the belly in a way that's not really aesthetically pleasing to the human eye. It didn't seem natural and it definitely wasn't predictable. Meissonier reworked his massive painting based on these new images. He also painted a portrait of Leland Stanford in which a book of Muybridge's images peeks out from under the railroad magnate's arm. Other painters like Edgar Degas and Thomas Eakins began consulting the horse in motion images too in order to bring the work closer to life. Others were not as willing. Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor of his era, thundered a defense of the truth of the human vision. It is the artist who is truthful, and it is photography which lies. For in reality, time does not stop, and if the artist succeeds in producing the impression of a movement which takes up several moments for accomplishment, his work is certainly much less conventional than the scientific image, where time is abruptly suspended. It is that which condemns certain modern painters who, when they wish to represent horses galloping, reproduce the poses furnished by instantaneous photography. Guéricault is criticized because in his picture Epsom Races, he has painted his horses galloping fully extended. I believe that it is Guéricault who is right, and not the camera, for his horses appear to run. Here, as everywhere in the domain of art, sincerity is the only rule. On an autumn afternoon in 1879, a group of friends are gathered once again in Stanford's mansion. Sitting in a dark parlor, they watch as Muybridge fires up his latest invention, the supraxiscope. He turns a wheel of images within it, projecting onto a screen a 2-second clip of a horse in motion, arguably the first screening of a motion picture. Muybridge had modified the zoetrope, a popular children's toy, but unlike the zoetrope, the images from the supraxiscope could be watched by several people at the same time. The film consisted of a large glass disc, roughly the size of a dinner plate. Due to the distortion caused by this setup, an artist had to redraw Muybridge's photographs to counterbalance the optics. The invention received enthusiastic acclaim from Stanford and cost nearly as big a steer as the horse photos. After a public showing in San Francisco the following spring, a newspaper reported, "Nothing was wanting but the clatter of hoofs upon the turf, and the occasional breath of steam to make the spectator believe he had before him the flesh and blood steeds." Muybridge published a series of large-format books of his stop-motion photographs, and after captivating America, he embarked on an European tour financed by Stanford. He was mostly celebrated in Paris and in England. Many of the most eminent men in arts, science and letters in Europe were present at the exhibition. Happily, I have strong nerves, or I should have blushed with the lavishness of their praises. Yours faithfully, Muybridge. Muybridge had the recognition he always wanted as an inventor and scientist, and it was all thanks to his patron, Stanford. The collaboration was, in Muybridge's words, an exceptionally felicitous alliance. Stanford, however, wasn't getting that much praise. One reporter pointed this out. "It is difficult to say to whom we should award the greater praise. To Governor Stanford for the inception of an idea so original, or to Muybridge for the energy, genius, and devotion with which he has pursued his experiments." In a letter to his old friend J.D.B. Stillman, Stanford writes, "It was my idea, my funding. The actual facts are that, from beginning to end, he was an instrument to carry out my ideas. I think the fame that we have given him has turned his head." Muybridge is about to get his greatest honor. The Royal Society of London, the most distinguished scientific institution of the time, has invited him to present a monograph. It's just 3 days before the presentation when he receives a note requesting his presence at the rooms of the society. "Upon my arrival, I was conducted to the council chamber and was asked by the president in the presence of the assembled council if I knew anything about a book then on the table, having on its title page the following: The Horse in Motion by J.D.B. Stillman, M.D., executed and published under the auspices of Leland Stanford. Muybridge freezes. Stanford has published a new book, but the author is listed as J.D.B. Stillman, Stanford's old friend. He opens the book and, to his horror, sees no credit given to him at all. He's just briefly mentioned as a technician. The book displays none of Muybridge's photos, but drawings based on his shots. The doors of the Royal Society were thus closed against me, and my promising career in London was thus brought to a disastrous close." Muybridge was deeply hurt and ended up suing his former patron, accusing him of wrecking his reputation with the contemptible tricks of a man whom I thought was a generous friend, but whose liberality turns out to have been an instrument for his own glorification. Despite this betrayal, the status of the photographer did not diminish, and Muybridge kept promoting photography as an art form that revealed hidden aspects of the world. He soon garnered support from a different set of patrons and started a 2-year study of animal and human motion at the University of Pennsylvania. He captured over 30,000 images portraying adults, children, and animals engaging in nearly every conceivable action. Back in Europe, 2 young French brothers are working on something far better than the Sopraxiscope. Their ideas come from several sources, but all of them trace back to Muybridge. By 1895, they had a camera and a projector sophisticated enough to create the intermittent motion necessary to project motion pictures. They called their device the cinematograph, and the rest is history. Muybridge, now 65, is left completely behind. He tells his assistant to destroy the glass discs and goes back home to Kingstown. He dies in 1904 in a completely changed world that has forgotten him. His name is misspelled on his own gravestone.